investigative reporting is being sort of squeezed out of the picture, and I think intentionally, because it tends to ruffle feathers. I mean, good investigative reporting does ruffle feathers, and it draws lawsuits, and it gets newspapers in trouble. My name is Gary Webb. I am an investigative journalist. I've been an investigative journalist for about 25 years for daily newspapers. And in 1996, I wrote a series of stories entitled Dark Alliance, which was about CIA involvement in drug trafficking. What my story showed was that the cocaine that was being sold in those neighborhoods was coming from mainly one source, and this one source was being used to finance a guerrilla war in Central America. The general idea of the CIA dealing drugs was something that the American mainstream press had never written about before, and that's why it prompted outrage among blacks, among drug reform activists, among politicians, by the CIA, by every federal agency involved in the drug war, because it showed they weren't doing their jobs, that it was a fraud. Right after we published the stories, the support we got from the media was very favorable. Newsweek magazine did a big piece on the story and said it was well documented and well researched. The website was getting like 1 million hits a day. There were marches in Watts, there were marches in Compton, there were candlelight vigils. Every California senator demanded an official investigation. So the story itself is really building momentum.
Here is Jane Pauley.
A super secret organization like the CIA is going to have secrets, but this sounded too bizarre to be true. Yet there it was, in print, in a respected newspaper. The accusation that the crack epidemic, which ravaged this country's cities, was spread with help from a secret army linked to the CIA. As you may recall, the story set off a firestorm of controversy. Then last month, a surprising twist. The newspaper which had first published this astounding story started to back away from it. Is the story true or not? Tonight, Bob McEwen takes a second look.
We are sick and tired of your excuses.
And I hope that you'll help to put an end to it, because we are tired and we're hurt and we're angry.
I will tell you, Director Deutsch, as a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time.
It was an American first. The director of the CIA, one of the country's most secretive institutions, facing the public at a town meeting in South Central Los Angeles.
If this information turns up wrongdoing, we will bring the people to justice and make them accountable.
An extraordinary event in response to an extraordinary accusation that people working with the CIA had a hand in sparking the crack epidemic that has devastated America's inner cities. Those charges came from this man, reporter Gary Webb of the San Jose Mercury News. He became one of the most talked about journalists in the country, his story the most controversial of the past year, because after investigating the origins of the crack epidemic, he claimed he found a link leading right to the CIA.
Men who were working for the CIA's army were responsible for bringing all that cocaine into Los Angeles that sparked the crack epidemic.
The CIA's army, Webb says, were the Contras, the anti-communist rebels fighting the government of Nicaragua back in the 1980s, an army founded and funded by the CIA. Webb wrote that some Contra supporters smuggled cocaine to America to raise money for their cause.
The CIA has been bringing drugs into this country.
As then CIA Director John Deutsch discovered, it's an accusation that rings true for many, especially for some in the African-American community. And Webb's story has taken on a life of its own.
And Gary,
On the talk show circuit and the internet, some have even gone beyond Webb's charges to accuse the CIA of conspiring to target young African Americans.
Was the CIA willing to poison our cities and crack cocaine?
Crack use spread like wildfire in the early 1980s. And in Los Angeles, a drug dealer known as Freeway Ricky Ross was in the middle of it. Prosecutors called Ross the Walmart of crack. He made millions in the early 80s dealing to Los Angeles street gangs. Police say he was among the first to take expensive cocaine powder and cook it into low-cost, highly addictive crack, then distribute it through the gangs.
It's destroyed our community. All the black men are in prison, most of us. The women are still strung on the drugs, kids without fathers, without mothers.
Police in Los Angeles say he virtually cornered the crack market, thanks to a steady supply of cheap cocaine. A pipeline so good that Ross was able to introduce crack to other cities, using his gang contacts, and to make himself, he says, a very rich man. Rick Ross's drug supplier did have connections to the Contras. Dateline has been able to confirm that from former Contra leader Eden Pastora. And Pastora admits he received some aid from that drug supplier. But Pastora says he was not aware of any CIA drug connection. So we asked Gary Webb, where is the evidence the CIA knew of any drug dealing?
You have to define the CIA. If you're saying that people who are working with the CIA know they were doing it, yeah.
Now retired, Dewey Claridge was the CIA's man in charge of Central America in the early 80s. He insists the agency had nothing to do with any drug trafficking or with any cover-up.
Oh, don't give me the conspiracy bullshit. Come on, you're a more intelligent man than that. Come on. I mean, come on. Listen, there has never been a conspiracy in this country.
Never? But in the mid-1980s, there was a high-level White House conspiracy called Iran-Contra. A Senate investigation led by John Kerry of Massachusetts found that individuals who provided support for the Contras were involved in drug trafficking, and that one or another agency of the U.S. government had information regarding the involvement, either while it was occurring or immediately thereafter. Incredibly, according to Senator Kerry, smugglers even used the U.S. government's own airlift operation at El Salvador's Ilopango airport to get cocaine back across the American border. This drug enforcement agent patrolled that same airport in the mid-80s.
It was just nonstop traffic coming and going, and nobody ever inspected their planes or their cargo or whatever.
Cele Castillo told Dateline he observed rampant drug smuggling at that airport.
Well, what we had was that we had Contra pilots flying out of Ilopango, smuggling drugs into the U.S., cocaine specifically.
He claims the smuggling was so open it had to be condoned by the U.S. government. Castillo says planes would arrive filled with supplies for the Contras, then leave carrying cocaine for America, bound for military airfields in Florida and Texas, offloaded out of sight of the law, then shipped to California and other points in the U.S. And there's more. Castillo says when he reported all of this to his bosses at the DEA, he was told to ignore it.
So you were told point blank? Point blank, stay away from it. It's a covert operation being run by the White House.
In a letter to Dateline, the Drug Enforcement Administration said it has vigorously investigated, and no evidence has ever been found to substantiate Mr. Castillo's charges. As for the CIA, it's denied ever aiding or condoning drug smuggling.
Reports were reaching the highest councils of our government, in the White House and in the Justice Department. There is no question of that. I can document that.
The White House and Justice Department disputed Kerry's report at the time, but he still believes some government officials turned a blind eye towards drug dealing in the mid-1980s, after the time at the heart of Gary Webb's stories. There were no indictments or prosecutions, and ultimately those allegations of drug smuggling became just a footnote in the scandal known as Iran-Contra.
The CIA is reviewing the charges made by Webb and says it will conclude its investigation by the end of the year. The House Select Committee on Intelligence says it will issue its own report and that its investigation will not be affected by the Mercury News' reevaluation of its series.
The government reaction was no reaction. And this, I believe, was a very careful strategy because nobody was going to believe the government if they came out and said we didn't do it. The proof was fairly overwhelming since we had all these government documents showing that it had happened. So what happened was they let the so-called liberal press speak for them. And they had the national security reporters at the Washington Post, who coincidentally used to work for the CIA, write stories saying it doesn't mean anything. It was a distraction from what the story said, and it became sort of a media war between the Mercury News, which stood behind the story at that point, and the rest of the establishment media who wanted us to back away from it. And part of that reason was because these major newspapers had written about this issue back in the 1980s, but had written about it very dismissively, as if this is nonsense, it doesn't happen, it never happened. And then 10 years later, we came back with documentation showing that it was absolutely true, and that it was worse than we imagined.
The reason why Michael is here today is because we are going to talk about this entire thing that's rumbling all over America. Was the CIA responsible for, in any way, shape, or form, funneling cocaine into the United States of America, helping to turn it into crack, and turning it into what is now devastated the majority of the inner cities of America? A lot of people say that this is just another bull case drawn up by black people who are just so paranoid to say that everything is a conspiracy. But today you're going to meet several people who are former employees of our United States government, people who have looked at this over years, who will say, whether it was a conspiracy or not, they don't want to talk about it. But did the CIA know that drugs were coming into the United States of America and help it get here? The answer to the question is yes.
Absolutely.
Does the CIA do this on a regular basis? The answer to the question is
absolutely. I wish I could take them to court.
And right now, just by virtue of the fact that Montel Williams is doing the show, someone is going to say, you see, it's another black journalist who is feeding into the conspiracy story. And most of you who know me know I'm probably one of the most conservative people in this country. I spent 20 years in the United States government working for the military. This show is about finding some truth and saying to the American people, let us get the answers that we demand, because it's our dollars that paid to bring coke to America. We'll be back right after this. We're talking today, this is really a show about what we can call rumors. The rumor that the CIA was involved in making sure that cocaine made it to the streets of South Central LA back in the early 80s, and then helped to develop and turn it into crack, which was then spread across America, and is the reason why most of our inner cities are in the plight that they are in. And a lot of this has been out there for years, but it wasn't until recently that the story broke again. And my next guest is a reporter, not from San Diego, California, but from San Jose Mercury News, and he wrote a story called The Dark Alliance. Please welcome Mr. Gary Webb to the show. And Gary, this really, I think the current fervor over this issue is because of your article. A lot of people may not be familiar with what the Dark Alliance meant and stands for. Why don't you tell America what the story is about first, and then we'll talk about the issues.
It was about a cocaine ring that operated along the west coast of the United States throughout most of the 80s. And they were funneling, they were selling cocaine in South Central. They were also selling it in Oakland. They were selling it in San Francisco. They were selling it in San Jose. And some of the money they were making was going to support an army that the men who ran the cocaine ring worked for, called the FDN. This was an army that the CIA started in 1981 and supported.
Better known to us, most of us who remember news, the Contras from Nicaragua. So go right ahead.
The men that were running the cocaine ring were top officials of this Contra army. And what we found was that they were selling this stuff in South Central, which is, predominantly black section of Los Angeles, immediately before the outbreak of the crack cocaine epidemic. They started selling powder. Tons and tons and tons of powder cocaine was going into this one small area of the city. And from there, they sold it to Freeway Rick. And Freeway Rick took the powder, turned it into crack, and starting in 1983, 1984, began distributing it to predominantly the gangs, the Crips and the Bloods in Los Angeles, and they spread it, from there.
From there. Now, since this has happened, you have butted heads with everybody in Washington D.C. trying to get information about the story. Have you not?
Yeah, we worked on this for a year, and it was only because some people at National Archives believe freedom of information means freedom of information. We got some documents that showed that pretty strongly that there were some CIA connections to this.
Let's talk a little bit about those documents for a second, because there's a gentleman, this figure that we talked about yesterday on the show. His name is Blandón. Danilo Blandón, who was a person who was a member of the aristocracy of Nicaragua before the fall of Somoza, and then he fled and comes to the United States and decides, while he's in the United States, so you can all understand this, he wants to raise money for the revolutionaries who are trying to overthrow the government that just overthrew them. So here in the United States, they try to do fundraisers, and that doesn't work, and then Blandón gets a scheme, well, I can get some cocaine cheaply, with some help from some of my friends, and get it into the United States of America. All I need to find is somebody who can sell it. So they find a gentleman by the name of Rick Ross, who is Freeway Rick. Rick Ross comes in and starts selling cocaine at the terms beginning 1 or 2 grams, and within weeks 2, 3, 4 kilos a week. Within months, what was it, 10 to 15 kilos a day. Ricky Ross was selling cocaine to the point of making $3 to $4 million a day. He sold so much cocaine, it hurt his fingers to count the money. Not only in Los Angeles, but in Cincinnati, in St. Louis, all the way across America. So some can say, and this is the reason why people are so angry at you in your article, is that Ricky Ross, the dope dealer, was supplied by the CIA because Blandón was an operative for the CIA, correct?
Blandón and Meneses were working for an army that was a wholly owned subsidiary of the CIA. They were meeting with CIA agents. Blandón, and this came out in court. I mean, Danilo Blandón is now a government witness. He works for the Drug Enforcement Administration, and we've paid him, I don't know, $166,000 over the last 18 months because he's such a good informant. So they put him on the witness stand in Ricky Ross's case, and he testified that in 1981, he went to Honduras, he met with the commander, the military commander of the CIA's army, and he was instructed to go raise money in California for this Contra army. And he was told that the ends justified the means.
And those ends being sell cocaine if you have to.
Well, look, he was in the room with the Nicaraguan representative of the Cali cartel, Mr. Meneses, and he was in the room with a government marketing expert named Danilo Blandón. Now, if they weren't talking about selling cocaine, I don't know what they were talking about.
And this is all information they can find on a website. I have to use that website, but on a website on the internet. So we're going to put that up so people can go and
look at these documents.
Take a look at the documents yourself and judge it. But Michael, now I mean, there's a stretch here. Here's a guy who is obviously a CIA operative, Mr. Blandón, who is working with this government-backed army that we've kind of created in Nicaragua. But how the heck does this guy get to bring in tons of cocaine? When I say ton, I'm talking tons. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tons of cocaine weekly in the United States of America for 7 years, and no one can ever catch him.
Well, number one, Mr. Meneses was actually indicted in 1984. He was known within, my own sources in DEA told me he was known as El Rey de la Droga, the king of drugs. He was in more than 40 files and indicted mysteriously, and people within DEA say that it was CIA intervention that kept this sealed indictment from ever being opened. So he was well known. He's well known. The connection between him, Blandón, and Calero, who was the head of the Nicaraguan government in exile, is clear. There's a clear evidentiary.
We got a picture of it.
Yeah, there's a clear evidentiary trail. Now, if you want to follow that trail up, you have to first understand how CIA and DEA work. I was a country attaché assigned to Argentina. Now, during those years, there were people who I inherited on the payroll who were murderers. They were also on the CIA payroll. So,
Murderers on the CIA payroll.
Not only murderers, I'm talking about mass murderers. And I wrote about it in books that I thought would have America marching on Washington. Nothing ever happened.
How are you alive today?
A miracle. Just absolutely.
Why didn't the CIA bump you off before you came to the Montel Williams show? Because to me, they will say tomorrow, He's a kook. He's crazy. Don't believe anything he has to say. Don't worry about it. There's no conspiracy.
Well, at the same time, DEA called me one of their best in a New York Times article. The only thing I can say, Montel, I lost my son. I lost my brother because of this phony CIA-backed drug flow. Somebody once said that if you don't have anything in your life to die for, you don't have anything to live for. And after losing my son, that's the story of my life. God bless Gary Webb. I've been trying to tell this, and other DEA agents are now coming out trying to tell this story.
Let me take a break. When we come back, we got a lot of people who disagree with all of this. They're here today. We're going to have a good argument. We'll be back right after this.
Gotten the story out around them, and we had gotten it out in a big way that they couldn't control, and that was through the internet. And I think a lot of this was directed at the Mercury News to say, we don't care what documentation you have, we don't care what kind of story you've got, we set the national news agenda, and if we don't like your story, we will kill your story regardless if it's true. The media rejoiced when this came out because it meant they had won. They had forced a newspaper to back away from a story that was true, simply because of this barrage of criticism, of mindless criticism, essentially, that really took its toll on the editors of the newspaper. And they were being seen as sort of outcasts from the club. And I think they made a political decision that it was better in the long run to take a dive on this story and get back in the good graces of the rest of the media. It was essentially a war between my editors and myself because I wouldn't apologize for the story or back away from the story, and fought them on it publicly. And so they transferred me to a bureau that was 140 miles from where I lived, and I called in sick a lot.
Our guest is Gary Webb. He is the author of this book called Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the Crack Cocaine Explosion. What led to this?
I had been covering the drug war for the Mercury News for a number of years, and this was an outgrowth of a story that I had done about the state of California's asset forfeiture program, which is a program where if the police believed you were a drug dealer, they could come in and take your house and your car and your money without even charging you with a crime. And I had been doing stories on that, and a young lady in Oakland had read one of them and called me up and put me onto a story about her boyfriend, who was an accused cocaine trafficker who had had that happen to him. He had his property taken away.
Danilo Blandon?
His name was Rafael Cornejo. It turned out that the key witness against him for the federal government was this fellow Danilo Blandon, who had been a leader of the Contras in California in the early 1980s and had been a huge cocaine trafficker in his own right. And when I got into investigating her boyfriend's case, I came across Blandon, and I came across his involvement with the Contras and his involvement ultimately with a major crack wholesaler in Los Angeles named Freeway Ricky Ross. And so I did a series that said that the crack market in South Central Los Angeles had been created in the early 1980s with the help of this Contra drug ring, and showed how once crack got hold in South Central and once the gangs got a hold of it, it was spread from South Central to other cities in the United States. And it ended up being a huge controversy.
You begin by talking about the Somoza family and the allegiance that the family in Nicaragua, the ruling family, had with the U.S. government for more than 40 years.
Right.
And then you write that the Americans wanted him to disappear. What happened?
Well, he became an embarrassment to the American government. His army, the National Guard, was committing human rights abuses. And remember, this was during the Carter era, and human rights were big on our agenda at that time. And so they came to him and said, this has gotten out of hand, you need to step aside, we need somebody else to take over. And at that point, they were still trying to salvage the American government's relationship with Nicaragua. Obviously, at that point, it was too late. And the Sandinistas came in and threw everybody out. And what happened was a lot of the men close to Somoza, a lot of the men from his army came to the United States because we had been allies with them for a long time. And among this flood of political exiles were these two major cocaine traffickers who set up drug ring along the West Coast and dealt tons of cocaine in the United States for many, many years while the U.S. government was aware of it.
So connect the events that began with this and then led to the series in the San Jose Mercury News, and you write about Howard Kurtz of the Washington Post, who you had a conversation with, claiming that the Mercury News was trying to suppress the story or parts of the story.
This was afterwards. After the series came out, my story and myself were attacked by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the LA Times for drawing conclusions that were unwarranted, essentially. And after the counterattacks in the media started, the Mercury News sent me back down to Central America. My partner George Hodel and I wrote another series of stories that essentially took the knowledge of this drug ring even further in the United States government. The Mercury did not print those stories, and Howard Kurtz called me up, and I mentioned to him that there were additional stories that we had written that the Mercury News was suppressing, and he did a column about it in the Washington Post.
Why did they suppress it?
At that point, you know, they had been beaten up for about 9 months by the mainstream media, and at that point, the decision was made: either we go forward with this story and we get beaten up some more, or we back off of the story and it goes away. And what they decided to do was back off of it and go, and you know, similar to what happened with the CNN Tailwind story. Pursuing it would have created a huge controversy. Backing away from it created a minor controversy at the time, and now the story's gone. It's off the radar screen.
So who's the Dark Alliance with?
The Dark Alliance referred to the allegiance between these Contra drug traffickers and the gangs of Los Angeles, who were their main customers.
And who are the Contras?
The Contras were former Somoza supporters, former Somoza military officers who had been kicked out of Nicaragua in 1979 and were trying to retake the country with the aid of the CIA. And the one thing that's important, and a lot of people don't recall because this is ancient history, you know, it happened 15 years ago, was that the Contras were a creation of the CIA. And so when our story came out saying that the Contras were dealing drugs in Los Angeles and elsewhere, and that these drug traffickers were meeting with CIA agents, a lot of people took that to say the CIA created the crack epidemic, which is clearly not the case. And I spent a great deal of time in the book talking about how crack was on its way at the time this happened. But the impact of it was that when you had all this cheap cocaine going into South Central Los Angeles, right at the time people were figuring out how to take this powder cocaine and turn it into crack, you had sort of a collision of historical events in a very odd place. And what happened from that was you had a spread of crack nationwide because the gangs spread nationwide. The gangs, after the LA market got saturated, took this to other cities and set up crack markets in other cities that didn't have them.
What led to your departure at the San Jose Mercury News?
Well, a number of things. The fact that the Mercury News backed off the story. I mean, I had worked a year on this. I had been an investigative reporter for them for 9 years, done a lot of major investigations for them, and you know, I had a very good reputation at that newspaper. The fact that they would back off this series because they were being criticized by other newspapers, I found very disheartening. And then I was taken off the story when I believed the story had only been half told. So one of the reasons I quit was to write this book and finish telling the story, because I think this is an important part of our history that had been denied us for a long time.
The book is called Dark Alliance by Gary Webb. It is published by 7 Stories Press in New York. There's an article in the latest edition of Esquire, the September edition, with the headline, The Pariah. Have you ever been called that before?
I've been called a lot of things before, but never a pariah, although in this case I think it's meant ironically.
Charles Bowden wrote the piece 2 years ago. Gary Webb wrote a series of articles that said some bad things about the CIA and drug traffickers. The CIA denied the charges, and every major newspaper in the country took the agency's word for it.
True. True, and that was the strange part about it, is that we laid out a series based on a year of investigation that had buku government documents. Most of the series is based on government documents, DEA reports, FBI reports, the testimony of government witnesses. And the other papers came back with unnamed sources, mostly unnamed government sources, saying, well, this couldn't be, we don't believe it, these drug traffickers weren't as significant as Webb made out. And that was it. And at that point, the series was viewed as discredited because unnamed government sources told the Washington Post that they didn't believe it. So You know, I think this is an interesting lesson for the press, and I think what you've seen as a result is the sort of CNN tailwind fallout now that investigating covert CIA operations, investigating the CIA in general, is now off limits to the press, unless you have what Ted Turner called proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which, when you're talking about covert operations, you're never going to find as a journalist.
So, from where you sit, who was telling the truth? CNN, the producers who were fired or let go, or the CIA?
I think that it's still an open question. I don't think the issue is solved at all, but the debate is over with. I mean, the tragedy of that CNN tailwind story is I think they had a good story. I think there was a lot of evidence to suggest that this occurred. The problem is when you retract it, it buries it forever. Nobody's going to look at it. And the issue is like radioactive now, and nobody will touch it again, and we'll never know the truth. I mean, if it's not true, there's ways to find that out. And I think the CNN story was significant enough to warrant congressional hearings. I mean, if you've got incidents of nerve gas being used against American defectors, that's something Congress should be looking at.
What are you doing these days?
I'm working for the California legislature investigating government agencies. I work for the Task Force on Government Oversight.
Could you see yourself working for a newspaper again?
I liked writing the book real well. I would like to keep writing books.
One of the things I'm proudest of in regards to that story is the website that the Mercury News set up, because it really was the first time that a newspaper brought its readers not only into the interior of the paper, but into the reporters' notebooks. You know, this was a story that, as I told my editors, had a very high unbelievability factor built into it. A lot of people were going to say, this can't be true. And this story became a sensation because of the website. Not because of the story, but because people could get to it. And they could never have gotten to it before, because the San Jose Mercury News is a small regional newspaper in Northern California that you couldn't read if you lived in New York, or you couldn't read if you lived in LA. But this story you could read anywhere in the world and see all of our documentation. So it became, and we did this on purpose to make it very hard to knock down, to make it very difficult for people to say this didn't happen. But they said it didn't happen anyway.
Here on Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Gary Webb, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter who wrote a series of stories linking the CIA to crack cocaine trafficking in Los Angeles, is dead. He died at the age of 49, found Friday morning at his home in Sacramento County, dead of an apparent suicide. Moving company workers called authorities after discovering a note posted on his front door that read, quote, "Please do not enter, call 911 and ask for an ambulance." Webb died of a gunshot wound to the head, according to the Sacramento County Coroner's Office. He's survived by 2 sons and a daughter. Gary Webb's 1996 series in the San Jose Mercury News, titled Dark Alliance, revealed that for the better part of a decade, a Bay Area drug ring sold tons of cocaine to Los Angeles street gangs and funneled millions in drug profits to the CIA-backed Nicaraguan Contras. It provoked a fierce reaction from the media establishment, which denounced the series. Following the controversy, San Jose Mercury News executive editor demoted Webb within the paper. Gary Webb eventually resigned and pushed his investigation even further, publishing the book Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion. Robert Perry, I wanted to play a clip of an interview that we did with Gary Webb on May 20th, 1998. It was just after his book, Dark Alliance, was published, and he talked about the media reaction to his investigation in the San Jose Mercury News. This is Gary Webb, 1998.
I tried to think of another example of where the mainstream press took off after a reporter, and the only one I was able to think of was when that fellow wrote that sort of confessional about how he'd worked at the Wall Street Journal and had been a socialist all these years. And the hue and cry that went up over, my God, we actually let a socialist write our news for us. That's really the only other time it's been, this quite this intense.
Well, we now have your book, Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion. Do you expect a similar explosion from the press, or will they try to deal with it by ignoring it?
Well, that remains to be seen. I think it'll be interesting. They couldn't ignore it before because it was in the newspapers. Now it's in a different arena. Now, books routinely get ignored that sort of challenge the status quo and challenge common knowledge. It might be more difficult this time because they had set up such a screaming contest earlier. This isn't the series anymore. This is 600 pages of documentation, of interviews. It's going to be awful hard to dismiss this as unsubstantiated or not backed up or overhyped, which were the criticisms that were directed against the series. Because the information's there now. It's all laid out, and it's, I didn't have to worry about some editor chopping off 15 paragraphs to make sure, the bra ad could fit on the page. I had the room to tell the story like it should have been told in the first place. And I think, looking back on this whole thing, I think the problem that we had in doing this series was that we were overly ambitious. We tried to tell a story in 10,000, 12,000 words that really needed about 150,000 words to tell accurately and tell completely. And it sort of, I don't regret doing it, and I'm glad we did, otherwise the thing would never have gotten out. But in doing the book, I realized how sort of crippled we were just by the medium that we were trying to do it in. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the mainstream's reaction to the book is, if there is one.
Gary, the way the mainstream press dealt with the black community, responding in the way they did, I found remarkably condescending. That was offensive. It was basically, the attitude was, we understand why these people are so upset. Something terrible has happened to them, and it's finally nice to be able to blame it on someone or something. Right. So we understand this kind of over-response, or this willingness to believe in conspiracy. I don't think there's any other word for it, but it was racist. I've never seen an entire race labeled as conspiracy theorists before, and this was really that's when I thought they'd really gone off the deep end, when they were trying to convince everybody that, well, these black people, they believe anything they're told, which was, when you boil it down, that's exactly what these articles are saying, and they tried to couch it in these very scientific and sociological terms as to why blacks distrust government. But the bottom line was, these folks will believe anything. And Tom Tomorrow did, I thought, just an amazingly good cartoon about this whole thing. When he had two New York Times reporters sitting around talking, and one of them said, well, just because the United States government has a history of lying to the American public, and just because there's 10 years of documented evidence of CIA involvement in drug trafficking, they actually think this might be true. And the other guy goes, those Negroes will believe anything. And that was sort of the reaction in a very cut down form of what these long wheezes in the Post. The New York Times did one, I think the LA Times did one, Washington Post did one on why of course black people are upset because they all believe that Kentucky Fried Chicken will make you sterile, and as if they have no reason whatsoever to believe that the United States government doesn't have their best interest at heart at times. Look at the Tuskegee experiment, and you could go on through history to explain why people of color would not trust the government. But the other thing that these stories missed was that it wasn't just black people that were upset by this thing. I was on a lot of right-wing talk radio shows, and the people that called into those shows were as mad or madder than the black audiences that I addressed, because these were people who
I think, like me, believed what they were taught in school about the government. You know, the government always has your best interest at heart. The government would never do anything to harm its citizens. Drugs are evil. We would never be involved in it. And when they read the story and when they saw the documentation that we presented, they knew that they had been lied to. They knew they had been lied to for about 10 years on this whole drug war thing. And they were really offended. It wasn't that they grew up distrusting the government. It was just the opposite. They grew up believing in it. And here was yet another example of why their faith had been misplaced, because, you know, American citizens had been sacrificed to fight this crazy war down in Central America that really didn't mean anything to anybody but the people at the CIA.
Gary Webb in 1998, May 20th, an interview we did when his book, Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion first came out. This is Democracy Now! We'll get a final comment from investigative reporter Bob Perry. As you listen to Gary Webb, your thoughts, Bob?
Well, I think it's quite sad that that voice has been silenced. It was tragic and sad that the mainstream press reacted as it did. As I said to the LA Times on Saturday when they asked for my comments, which they did not publish, by the way, I said, you're going to have a hard time dealing with this story because the LA Times never even reported on the publication of the second volume of the CIA's report. And it was that second volume that went through in great detail, really corroborating not just what Gary Webb had reported, but allegations and evidence that's far, far worse than what was in the San Jose Mercury News series. This was a far darker scandal, went far higher up than anyone thought. The CIA's evidence even tracks the Contra cocaine problem into the White House, Ronald Reagan's White House. It tracks it into the CIA directly. That's what the evidence is. I'm putting up a story today on consortiumnews.com that will recount some of this evidence that has been lost to history. And it's just tragic that the LA Times and other major publications cannot now face the truth.
Well, Bob Perry, on that note, I want to thank you for being with us. People can check that story out at consortiumnews.com. And you can go to our website at democracynow.org, where we will compile all of Gary Webb's interviews. Gary Webb, the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, died of an apparent suicide. That does it for today's program. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke.
And finally tonight here at InfoWars Nightly News, I want to share with you personally what was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I went to see Kill the Messenger. It's been out for about a week in the United States and worldwide, based on a book by Gary Webb, who was, of course, the journalist who wrote the Dark Alliance story back in the late 1990s about the CIA and the crack cocaine epidemic. And as I watched the 2-hour film, it was really more of a documentary than it was an action thriller based on a true story. And I've got to say that the producer and also the lead star, Jeremy Renner, deserves multiple Academy Awards for his lead role, because I knew Gary Webb and knew him well, and for the production. I don't know if it'll win all those awards because the average person or even the Academy doesn't have the inside knowledge I have on this. I knew Gary Webb very, very well. I never met him in person. I had to have interviewed him 15 times or more, sometimes for 2 hours at length on my syndicated radio show in the same time slot it is today. Because back then he was an outcast. He'd won all these awards for his Dark Alliance piece. They tried to discredit it, never really discrediting it. And, of course, now it's been declassified just a month ago that the CIA admits that they did target him, they did try to destroy him. And watching the 2-hour film, I ran through the gamut of emotions. Intellectual realization of tyranny, what a hero Gary Webb was. I felt terrible for his friends, editors, and others that turned their back on him under the pressure and the propaganda, going through a lot of the similar things that Gary Webb has gone through. I empathized with him. And then all the interviews and all our private conversations began to come back to me, and I actually felt nauseated when the CIA was threatening his children, and when he had people breaking into the night to his apartment and because I remember Gary Webb telling me about all this.
The general idea of the CIA dealing drugs was something that the American mainstream press had never written about before.
I remember Gary Webb sending me a disc of documents that he wanted me to put online for his new book that was coming out. And he wanted to break a lot of that information on my show because I was willing to do it. And then I also shared guilt with the rest of the people in the movie, because even though I'd had him on and knew the CIA was bringing in drugs, hell, they'd been doing that since the 60s on record with opium out of Vietnam, it was that I already knew that. I'd already interviewed him a bunch. And so it was kind of an old story. And I thought it was a war we'd won getting the truth out. I didn't realize they were still destroying him, and he was fighting for his life. And he told me they were threatening him and breaking into his house. He told Freeway Ricky Ross, who I've interviewed probably 10 times as well, the first interview from prison. We got that with Kevin Booth years ago. Ross said on my show right after he committed suicide, after Webb died, that he had told him they were going to kill him. And how they do it is they come to your house, they say, we're going to kill your kids. If you don't, fill out this suicide note. And then they'll show you photos of your kids, you know, riding their motorcycle or getting off the school bus. And then they shot him twice in the head. And they undoubtedly murdered him. Then they threatened the family and they shut up. And I kept expecting in the movie that they would go along with the suicide narrative. They didn't do that. They clearly imply the CIA killed him. It's just a masterpiece. I mean, that's all I can say. And thank God this happened, because Gary Webb will now get his reputation back posthumously. And it will send a major message to the establishment that you can even kill the messenger, but that you can't kill the signal.
Authentic journalism is telling people something that the government doesn't want them to know.
That's madness.